A very warm welcome. My name is Adrian Reed, and it's my real pleasure to have, in fact, for the second time on a BA community webinar, Dr. Alexia Nalewaik. A little bit about Alexia. So, Alexia is the owner of Pellucid Projects LLC and occasionally a lecturer at higher education institutions such as the University of Virginia, George Washington University, and American University. She's a quantity surveyor and a researcher with over 30 years' experience in audit, risk analysis, social value, and cost management for complex capital mega programs. Of particular note, her third book, Strategic Project Analysis, a powerful set of cost benefit tools and techniques for managers, was recently released. And the more I've spoken to Alexia over the last few years, the more I've thought that there's a lot that we in the business analysis space can learn from the sort of thing that you do, Alexia. So thank you so much for being here and talking to us.
Well, thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, well, no, absolute pleasure. So, I mean, let's get straight into the topic, really. I suppose for many of us on the line here, we'll be thinking that traditionally projects tend to focus on, quantitative, so particularly financial gains. And I suspect many people tuning into this webinar will be familiar with like internal rate of return, IRR, net present value, these types of things. Like, what's your view on that? Are those measures sufficient on their own?
It's interesting that you asked that because when I first did my project controls certification, I studied that traditional cost benefit analysis methodology. In fact, it was actually my favorite part of the exam. For some reason, I was good at it, and it made sense to me. But over time, things have been changing. So if you look at recent legislation in the UK, trends in Europe, trends in Australia, um, there's now legislation for public funding for projects or initiatives that are beginning to require a demonstration of social value. And that social value component is sometimes very difficult to state in financial terms.
Yeah, yeah. Can you give an example of what you mean by that social value? Because that's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, I could. And some of it might be so for in the traditional methodology, in addition to quantifying, monetarily the exact, sort of monetary costs of doing things, there's also a tendency to use financial proxies for
Hmm.
other costs and benefits. So impacts to people's lives are sometimes monetized. But the question then is really is $1 million for a person's life the same as spending $1 million in capital improvements for something? They don't really equate.
Yeah, that's true. So, and again, I'm thinking about the type of projects I've worked on, and those, those intangible benefits are really, really hard to handle in a business case because, how do you measure like better customer experience? I mean, there are ways of measuring it, but how can you monetize it? Anything is a bit of a guess, isn't it? Oh, well, we give better customer experience, so are they going to buy from us like twice as much, three times as much? You never know, right? So
So
so,
at best it's a guess. And
yeah,
then also, if you look at my field, which is construction, the construction industry has actually done perhaps better than some other industries in reacting to this recent legislation requiring demonstration of social value because they tend to be able to quantify fairly quickly how many internships they have or how many trainee programs, how many jobs they're creating, and those can be fairly readily quantified. But if you look further afield at changes in changes in pollution and cleanup, or the advantages of perhaps faster internet rather than slower internet, those are a little harder to discuss.
Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. And now you see, now the moment you said that, my mind went to a complete off on a complete tangent, which is, also, like if I think about the types of projects that I suspect many people on the call work on, it's like, okay, so let's imagine there's an organization, it's going to run it's going to, implement a new IT system that's using AI, that's actually going to create more carbon emissions. And like,
Mhm.
there's a disbenefit of doing that to the environment potentially, depending on the sort of source of fuel. So I suspect we're starting to get into the topic of strategic analysis here, strategic project analysis, which I know is a core theme of your recent book. So, what is strategic project analysis?
At its simplest, it's just a process by which an organization can consider different scenarios or different projects, different opportunities for investment, and then prioritizing those and selecting the one with which they wish to move forward.
And so you mentioned social value as being one thing
Mm.
that's sort of above and beyond the traditional IRR, net present value. What else differentiates that approach from like the more traditional financial type approach?
So what happened and the way this book actually came about was that I was teaching engineering economics and project finance at George Washington University. I also developed and was teaching a cost benefit analysis course for American University, which lasted a number of years and had some upgrades with other people contributing to the methodologies and the course information. And at one point, I was teaching both concurrently and looking at them and thinking these two departments are treating what's essentially a very similar methodology completely differently. Sometimes even to the extent of using the same equations and teaching and treating them differently, which to me was utterly fascinating. And for a bit, I thought maybe I was misreading, but it turns out that I wasn't. And what we were talking about really was an issue of perspective
Mm.
in the way that these different analyses were approached. So on the one side for engineering projects or machine life replacement or repair, it was clearly just a financial decision. And the perspective was from the owner's point of view, how much do we wish to spend and what's the benefit, what's the additional life expectancy of this machinery versus looking at development projects, the sort that are done by evaluation experts, and really looking at not necessarily an owner's or investor's perspective, but the end user perspective of what does the most good for the community. So that's the difference between the two. And I started to go down this rabbit hole really of looking at both of them and thinking, trying to figure out why they were so different, and then thinking, I've never actually seen anybody compare these two on paper. So
Mm.
I started writing.
Wow, wow. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. So, uh, I mean, I suppose one thing in fact, one thing we were talking about before we went live actually was risk. Um, um, and if I think about business cases and project selection, risk is part of that, but also, you come across biases and logical fallacies, biases, cognitive biases, whatever we want to call them. The sunk cost fallacy is a one that I certainly see a lot. So, I mean, how do things like risk and biases play into the sort of approach that you're suggesting?
Right. Well, the sunk cost fallacy is a real thing, especially in my world where you just don't see half-built dams. A
Yeah,
half-built
yeah,
freeway.
yeah.
I mean, it's just once they've started, they kind of keep going. But so yes, the questions about biases and being aware of particular biases is very important. And there are so many. I think there is something in one of the presentations I do on bias. There are over 250 types of cognitive bias. And they're related to groupthink and influence by others, or what we think we know, or basing our data on a very small population and expecting that something will go the same. So that's something that I consider in the book. But also part of the other question that I'm addressing in the book is that the world of project management is changing, and there's now a lot of discussion about benefits management. But in order to manage benefits, you need to plan them. And at some point, I presume those are included in the project selection discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another really interesting aspect as well, because, and in fact, when it comes to benefits, I can't help in my head but think about benefits and biases in the
Mhm.
same sentence, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been in a situation where it's like basically, it's almost a write a business case which proves I'm right. Actually, I've already made a decision, so write the business case that
Exactly.
proves it. And
Mhm.
and, and, and an important part of certainly an analyst's job is to not do that, right? You actually have to give it that kind of scrutiny. Um, so thinking about this sort of strategic approach, the approach in your book and from your research, if you imagine flicking through a business case or whatever document is used to select projects, in my head, I can imagine what a traditional business case would look like. It's probably going to have a background, it's going to have an executive summary, it's going to have probably three options. Hopefully not the Goldilocks options where it's like, too little, too much, just enough. But there's some proper options in there, and then investment appraisal. Would a business like a strategic project business case look different? Would it have additional sections in it?
It would have additional sections, so it would be more of a mixed approach, applying evaluation techniques such as cost effectiveness analysis, where you're using a Likert scale basically to measure the effectiveness of an action in creating a certain change in a situation. And also, there are other evaluation techniques such as max and min and min and max, meaning choosing the scenario that causes the least damage or choosing the situation that has the most impact for people or impact for the most number of stakeholders. So in the book, I do sort of walk through the traditional equations and then the evaluation equations and compare and contrast them and talk about when you might want to use that equation or also how it might be misused.
Interesting. You mentioned a Likert scale there, which from memory that's like a 5 point scale, I think, or five or
Yes.
six. And so how does that work? Is that something where you sort of survey out and get insight, or how do you come up with a response to that?
It could be done through surveys or it could be in internal analysis. But the idea is that you can score things higher or lower depending on what your preferences are. And at the same time when I was writing the book, I was actually my washing machine died. And so all partway through the book, I start providing examples of different equations and different approaches for determining what I should replace the washing machine with, and even at one point, just for fun, whether or not I should replace it. But of course, I'm not going to do my laundry by hand anymore, but not that I ever did. But still, just for fun, I included that as an option. And so you can see how the results change depending on the equation that I use and the approaches that I take, and even the weighting that I add to certain characteristics. So if I think price is more important, I might weight that more heavily. But if I think maybe all the technology gadgets or potential repair costs are more important, then I might weight those as well. So I walk through different examples of here's this approach, weighted and unweighted, and you can see that I actually get completely different results.
That's really interesting because I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking there are all sorts of qualitative aspects which are actually an important part of making a decision
Mhm.
that often are just not part of the equation. So
Yeah.
so for example, again, I mean I'm going to use an IT example just because of what's in my head at the moment, but like does a particular solution, is it part of the target architecture? Like how closely does it fit with the target architecture? Um, and actually, something like a Likert scale is a way of feeding those sorts of things in numerically rather
Mhm.
than just having a, well, this one fits fairly well, this one doesn't. You can actually do a bit more of a quantitative comparison. I'd never ever thought of doing stuff like that before. That's really interesting.
So you can have different columns and you can say, here's where this scenario ranks in terms of monetary cost, but here's where it ranks in terms of effectiveness or impact or desirability.
Yeah. We've got a question in from Michelle. So and just a reminder to everyone on the line, please do type your questions in the Q&A tab as they occur to you. Um, and Michelle asks a really tricky question, so good luck with this one, Alexia. But Michelle asks, trying to ensure that multiple projects don't all claim the same financial benefits. So, for example, decreased costs can be really tricky. With intangible benefits, it would surely be even harder. So, how can organizations ensure they attribute benefits to the right cause? I mean, that disambiguation of benefits is such a tricky one. How
Um,
would you approach that?
I am certain we could have a 2 hour discussion on cause and effect and tracking cost to its source. I agree that's really quite tricky. And I think in this particular instance, and really in any instance, that what it comes down to is when you're doing the analysis, very carefully documenting assumptions that are made and any omissions that have been consciously made, and ensuring that that's transparent when the results are produced and presented.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, so many people tuned into this session will be BAs, and I know you and I have spoken over the years about business analysis and related stuff. So, what from your perspective, what do you think the role of a business analyst would be in this approach that you're talking about?
Oh, we have an extra panelist apparently. So I would say that first off, the responsibility for the BA is to remain aware of legislative changes and evolution of the practice, but also to keep, never stop learning, perhaps. We're looking at basically a broadening of the scope of BA and also the skill set.
Yeah, and
And
I think
that's just staying on top of your profession, really.
yeah, I think that's true. I think, and I'm sure people on the call would agree with this. There's always changes in the in the environment, and it's really crucial to stay on top of these things. So, if you were to think about, I don't know, two or three techniques or equations or things that it would be useful for BAs to know about. When they undertake or when they're involved in business cases and project selection, what sort of things should we be Googling or reading about?
I think, so I mentioned a couple of the techniques that are used in evaluation on a more qualitative side, but I think also staying aware of the benefits planning and benefits management discussion is really pretty important. And we are going to see, I believe, in some countries, much more discussion about social value and these benefits that can be affected through major projects or any projects, really. Sometimes it comes down to maybe the level of altruism of the owner organization or their global strategy. Did I just get two dogs in here?
We've got three panelists now, two additional visitors on the panel in the panel.
So ridiculous. All
Um,
right.
excellent. I think and again, benefits management is a whole wider topic. But of course, actually, I like starting by actually properly identifying benefits
Mhm.
And because benefits management, and I think sometimes, or at least in the context I work, there's a arguably mistaken belief that benefits management is about identifying the benefits, then putting that calculation in a drawer, and then seeing whether they were realized at the end.
Right.
Whereas like in my view, and I'd be interested to see if you share this view, that no, you use it like you want to try and maximize it, and that means that benefits realization that needs to be part of the fabric of the project.
And it's a process just like risk management. You don't just create your risk of lists and say, whoops, tick that box, let's move on. Instead, you're constantly keeping an eye on how that's changing. You get emergent benefits, just like you get
Mm.
emergent risks, benefits you didn't plan on or disbenefits.
Yeah, so what I'd be really interested to know, because you work in or have worked in construction in a very different type of a context than I have. Like, how do you get people like who are building a dam or whatever? Like, how do you keep people interested in the benefits? Because like I've never worked on anything as big as building a dam, and it's hard to keep people interested in benefits on even a relatively trivial project. How do you keep people excited about them? Or so because projects get momentum, and it's almost like, well, we're just going to keep going.
I don't know if I have tips and tricks for keeping people excited about things. It's hard enough to keep people excited about risk. It's sort of like pulling teeth to get people to participate in the process. But yeah, it's really, I think that tone needs to come from the top within the organization, if it isn't coming from an external funding source.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So actually, it's a lead by example from the
Mhm.
people who are funding or directing
Yes.
or owning.
And
Um,
that might even occur if the desire for benefits is coming from stakeholders or end users. If your consumer is demanding it, then an organization might react earlier.
hmm. Yeah, in fact, picking up on something you said earlier, Alexia, you mentioned that part of you mentioned how the book came about, and you were looking at these different approaches and using the same equations for different reasons. And you mentioned, if I heard correctly, that there's an aspect of sort of looking at something from the end user's perspective. So
Yeah.
what they would think of as a benefit, rather than just the sponsor, the commissioning organization, the owner, or whatever. So I suppose what strikes me with that is there's going to be conflict, right? Or
Mhm.
those perspectives are going to be different, and the person paying is probably going to win that argument most of the time.
Yes.
Um, so how do you balance that, or do you have to kind of advocate for the end user to get that balance right?
So that's really a matter of perspective. And the perspective that is taken in doing this sort of analysis can greatly change the outcome. So it just happened that at the same time as I was teaching these courses, I was also working on some projects that were radio astronomy and space science projects.
Wow.
And very often in their proposals, they mention the concept of broader impacts, which is how much STEM education and skill growing is occurring, public outreach, all this sort of stuff. And so at one point, I just started asking questions, and I thought, well, this would be some interesting sort of spare time research to do. And I ended up interviewing people at a number of facilities around the world because I just couldn't stop. And I ended up with a lot of data really about the generational change that occurs when these facilities are built. So in the book, I also have examples of space science projects, radio astronomy, and others where we're talking about generational changes in the graduation rate from schools in the local area where the facility was constructed, and the number of students who have gone off to university and come back with engineering and maths degrees. Areas where the graduation rate was previously on the order of 30% to now those schools winning national awards for science instruction.
Wow. Wow,
Yeah.
that's awesome. And I mean, again, I suppose that that pivots the conversation back to societal good. And again, with my business analysis hat on, one thing that I often think about is, I have friends, colleagues who work in environments like public sector, governmental, charity
Mhm.
environments, where some of the projects are not financial,
Right.
or they're not primarily financial because if you are, if you're working in a hospital and you're implementing a new, a new electronic patient record system, well, yes, you might be looking to reduce the administrative cost, but you're probably primarily looking to improve patient outcomes, I would hope.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
like, what would a business case look like where there's no, like literally the finance isn't the primary motive? Would you use things like the Likert scales that you mentioned, or are there other things that can go in there?
You can use that. You can also use the monetary proxy concept, which is very frequently applied in evaluation settings. But again, there are problems and challenges with that. And I've even seen the equations used in such a way that instead of, the traditional equation is benefits minus cost divided by cost. I've even seen those equations changed to be just benefits divided by cost instead of net benefits, just total benefits over total cost, which is, you could argue it's either a new equation or a misuse of the traditional one, right? But I have seen equations flipped around really to suit the perspective of the agency doing the analysis. And I've also read about challenges that have occurred in government policymaking. So there was a study done at one point over, I believe, 13 years of government policy making on environmental protection. And the conclusion was that 80% of the cost benefit analyses, and due to the problems of meaningful calculation of those benefits, monetization of it, and quantification, they actually excluded the benefits that were considered the most important or significant to the analysis. And therefore, the analysis results were based on what? Insignificant elements? They somehow managed to not measure the very thing they're trying to pass a policy on. Um,
Wow.
and I will protect the guilty by not mentioning which country that was, but I might be living in it.
Interesting. So we've got another question from Michelle. And Michelle asks, or Michelle says, it's fascinating to hear about the broader societal impact of projects. Do organizations hang around long enough to measure things like that? And would different decisions be made if they did, do you think? I mean, that's a really good aspect.
So that is actually a wonderful question, and it is something that I mentioned in the book because the the cost, right, of identifying benefits and tracking benefits is a very real one. And I believe more funding needs to be provided to actually address this. We're having all these conversations about benefits management, but not about how much it costs to do that and how long you keep doing it for. So yes, it is. There are some organizations that do hang around long enough, and I've been very fortunate to be in the archives of some of them, tracking over 50 years of benefits that have occurred in in the very facilities that were constructed, along with seriously reading typed memos on onion skin paper. And I mean, we haven't
Wow.
gone back as far as cuneiform, but I've definitely seen evolutions of corporate paper over the years.
Wow. Okay. So there are organizations out there that are properly, and I mean that's another misconception that I find a lot with benefits is it's almost like the, and I mean, well, there are several misconceptions to unwrap there, but one is the whole, okay, we'll implement a change and it's going to be like a straight line. We're gonna
Right.
something's going to and then we get all of the benefits on day one. And I have to have that awkward conversation where it's like, actually, what's probably going to happen is everything's going to dip. Because people are going to get used to it, and you're going to get some, you're going to get some uncomfortableness, but then it's going to rise over time. And actually, over the life of whatever it is that's been built, there's going to come a point where it's going to dip again because whatever you build as it gets older, it tends to take more cost to maintain. So that's when you need to think about retiring or decommissioning or whatever. Um,
Yes.
and and the other misconception I find is that people, because there's sometimes a perception of, oh right, well we deploy and then there's all these benefits. It's like right, so we'll deploy and then we'll measure like that day, a month later, and a month after that, and then that's
Hmm.
done. And it's like no, no, this is if you
Yeah.
actually because and one thing I I find is that like there's a missed opportunity for organizational learning
Hmm.
because
Yes.
if an organization measures properly, then if the figures start to go weird, it's like okay, that something's changed. Like maybe the
Yes.
environment's changed, maybe we built the wrong thing, maybe there's a small tweak that will release the rest of the benefits. So yeah, I think that's a message that needs to get out into the world.
Yeah. And so there are, it's definitely possible to do an ex post analysis and then look through archival records and sort of tease out what occurred that made those benefits appear. So I've been doing a bit of that as well. But some organizations do track it. I think the more we have discussion about benefits management, the more this is going to occur. It
Yeah.
certainly wasn't done in say even 60, 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I suppose that brings me to another point with a business analysis hat on, which is actually we need to start thinking about specifying mechanisms for tracking benefits as part of the change, because if there's a particular benefit, there might need to be some form of collecting of data that's not collected yet. So actually, to get a
Mhm.
baseline, we've got to get something in place to collect it, and then
Yeah,
for monitoring that, there needs to be some mechanism for doing it as well. So it comes back to that holistic thinking about how this is going to impact the organization, its customers, the world, whatever. Um,
yeah,
so
that's true.
taking a slight sidestep, a topic that seems even more relevant now for so many reasons is ethics. Um, uh, I mean, just for one reason, because when you look at some of the tech that's emerging, so AI, everyone's talking
Mhm.
about AI, but and there are benefits of AI, but actually, depending on the training data that's being used, that could have all sorts of positive and negative unintended consequences for groups of people. And sadly, sometimes best value from a financial standpoint
Mhm.
might arguably be least ethical. Not always, but it could be. So is there a way of working ethics? This is a really stretch of a question, but is there a way of working ethics into a business case in a way that you can consider different alternatives based on how ethical they are or aren't?
I would actually sort of turn that around a little bit to say that in general, I am inclined to believe that most people performing the analysis are doing so in an honest fashion, right? And in fact, many professional institutions require that if you're going to be chartered or if you're a member,
Yeah,
honesty and integrity are an element of that. But literally every single aspect of project selection has an ethical component. So the discount rate that you're using to calculate present value, that
true.
has an ethical component. If you're trying to evaluate long-term environmental effects that are occurring 50 years down the line, frankly, if you have any discount rate on that whatsoever, it's going to have a benefits value of zero when you're doing present value analysis. Also, if you look at assumptions that are made, omissions, the perspective that's taken, the very scope of the analysis, and the time frame. Are you analyzing over 5 years or 10 or 15? Because if you've shortened the timeline on it, you could be omitting benefits that perhaps should be taken, or disbenefits, not to forget those, that should be taken into account. Even the process of selecting which stakeholders and end users to consider is an ethical question. And also one in which there can be considerable bias as well. So if you can, sort of slice and dice stakeholders any way you wish, right? End users, people who live in the vicinity of a project, people who are paying for the project or not paying for the project. But in evaluation practice, very often to avoid that appearance of bias or um, or attention to certain focus groups is really to address a geographic boundary rather than any other defining factor, such as gender or race, religion, level of employment, level of education. There are so many different factors in talking about stakeholders that it becomes an ethical component.
That's really interesting. And it comes back to a question that I think is so important when thinking about engagement or consultation or anything, which is it's not who do we include, it's who are we prepared to exclude,
Mhm.
right? And I know that that's that initially it's interesting because like that usually that has quite a visceral response for people and they say, well, nobody, we don't want to exclude anybody. It's like, yeah, but that's not the world like that. Then you're including the whole world,
Right?
which is laudable, but perhaps not realistic. So actually, what like who do we based on what we're doing, how far are we going to draw that circle? That geographic circle or proximity to whatever. Yeah, and it's interesting. Something I remember reading in a paper you wrote, and I probably mentioned this to you before, but it's always stuck with me. Not really related to this, but I remember you wrote about how whistleblowing on construction sites, like there's often for safety issues, you can blow the whistle, but actually that there are all sorts of concerns with that because you have to be in a place of privilege to blow the whistle because
Yes.
if you think you're not going to get your next contract because you've blown the whistle and there might be blacklists or block lists of contractors who have blown the whistle and so you start to think of all of these elements as well where actually are people who are perhaps have information that might contradict some of the assessments in the business case, are they empowered to put their hand up and say, that figure is ridiculous? You
Hmm.
know,
Exactly.
yeah, but you're double counting those things. I always remember early in my career, I pointed out to someone that there was double counting in a business case, and I was just told, yeah, but we'll find the benefit somewhere else, so we'll leave it in. And I was like,
Mhm.
well, just don't write a business case then, because you'd like it's fabrication, you know. Um, but yeah. So
Very,
anyway,
very true.
sorry, Alexia, I digressed there quite a
No,
lot.
no, no. This is quite fine. So to bring it back though to social value, another thing that I include in the book is a discussion about using the United Nations sustainability goals, the 17 sustainability goals, and also the Rockefeller Foundation's 12 resilience goals as a checklist for social value is actually pretty easy to do. Now, in my world, I get very, very frustrated because when I use the word sustainability, everybody says, oh, yes, environmental. And when I say resilience, they say, oh, yes, flooding. And I say, well, actually, there's a lot more in that. It's about having a self-sustaining economy. It's about ensuring that you've considered all different types of people, equality for women. The list is so long that I get very I get very frustrated. I apologize.
No, that's fine. And yeah, and again, that's really interesting because that shows a potential divergence because, and this is another interesting thing. I always think that when it comes to strategy, there's stated or espoused strategy. There's the and values as well. There's the values that the organization says it has, and that's useful. It might it gives an indication, but then you look at what it's actually doing, and
Mhm.
what it's actually doing. Those are its actual values in force. So
Yes.
So that's another really interesting aspect is you could include if an organization like the sustainability goals and resilience goals, and actually if an organization's got its own values, it's like, well, how congruent is this project with its
Right.
stated values? I think that would be really interesting for many organizations to do.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have an organization that is claiming to embrace sustainability goals, are their goals solely carbon reduction or are they broader? I think I
Yeah.
inhaled a dog treat. I swear I don't know what I did.
Um, without giving too much away, what else can people expect when they read your book? Because we've discussed quite a lot already, but like, what other things are people going to get from reading your book?
So I do include in there a number of scenarios regarding construction, major events, government policy making. But then also I include a section on critical questioning. So if you are reading a strategic project analysis or cost benefit analysis, or as evaluation puts it, benefit cost analysis report, you have intelligent questions that you can ask, right? What assumptions or omissions or exclusions were there? What discount rate was used? What stakeholder population was consulted? Is there evidence of bias? What perspective was taken? If you look at perhaps a toll road, you have three perspectives there. You have the agency that, perhaps a government agency that wants to build the toll road. You have the owner, the ultimately the owner operator, right, of the toll road, or operator of the toll road who wants to make a profit. And then you have the individual drivers who really would prefer not to pay for it at all. Or,
Mm,
or maybe they would be happy to pay for it because they'll take the toll road and get somewhere faster, whereas someone not taking the toll road has a longer commute with more traffic. So the perspective question is also huge, looking at whether the report was written internally or by an external, presumably independent consultant. So I have a list of over 10, perhaps 12 or 14 questions that you can ask to really consider the context and the content of an analysis report, and you can come to your own conclusions.
that's really powerful, and I think so much was resonating when you talked about perspectives there. And I've got a bit of a systems thinking background, and perspectives is a really big thing in systems thinking as well. And the concept of actually different people having different worldviews, and if you've got a system in inverted commas or a service,
Mhm.
whatever we want to call it, actually there are going to be different people thinking that thing exists for entirely different reasons. And if it's going to succeed, you've actually got to meet an accommodation of those sorts of, you've got to it's never going to be concept. Like, one of the things I always think is interesting is you read some books and textbooks and so on, and they talk about consensus. But I don't know if I've just been unlucky, but consensus to me is the outside unusual case. Like,
Mhm.
if you've got anything big and complex which is changing something that people care about, just getting something where all the parties can live with it and live with each other
Mhm.
is sometimes a bit of, it's an achievement. Obviously, consensus
And
would be wonderful, but.
I would say your experience with consensus and my experience with risk is very similar. Usually you have one large, sort of very, very important, powerful person in the room who's managing to color what everybody else in the room says. And you just get a bunch of nodding heads and no discussion, no differing points of view.
Yeah. Well, and,
Yeah.
and that brings back another thought which I've had a thread as we've been talking here, is like, the need for respectful and constructive dissent.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yes.
and and I draw a distinction away from destructive dissent, which is not useful and can be toxic. But actually, you know, I think, and it's one of those things that certainly in British culture, this is considered probably terribly rude to say to someone, but actually saying, on what evidence are you basing that assertion?
Mhm.
It's a really important thing to say, because sometimes the answer is none, and it sounds like,
Yes, exactly.
okay, so that's anecdotal at best. So we have another question that's come in, which is, how would you balance the need for thorough, detailed analysis and information in a business case with the practical need for cases to be easy to understand, review, and question by leaders? And that's a really critical point as well, because I am sure many of us have worked with people who are like, if you can't condense it down to a slide, don't come and see me, you know.
Yes, and I actually do address this in the book because I would argue that every analysis is necessarily reductionist in some fashion. If you were to try to include every stakeholder, every benefit, every disbenefit, every cost, you'd be there all day, and it would cost you a fortune to do the cost benefit analysis, let alone be able to finance the project, right? So the question is really one of materiality in the outcomes when you discuss costs, benefits, and disbenefits. And materiality is related to impact. So there may be a decision made to exclude certain things from the analysis, and then that would need to be written up in the exclusions or omissions section and say we excluded this for these reasons, because for whatever, and acknowledge that up front rather than pretending that the entire analysis was as comprehensive as possible.
Yeah,
You get
that's a
sort of
really
a what is it, the rule of diminishing returns, right?
yeah, yeah, and I think that's really important as well, isn't it? To acknowledge any known weaknesses or known omissions, not omissions because they're not, you know, because the stuff that's been deliberately disregarded or not included, so that like that,
Mhm.
so that's so that people know that's a conscious decision. It's not been omitted by, you know, by mistake.
Mhm.
Um, so
I'm going to mention here that there's something added to the chat where we were discussing
oh yeah,
having productive discussions in and trying to get to consensus. And there's a comment here from a participant that says disagreeing is okay, demonizing is not okay. Task conflict is okay, but personality conflict is not. And then a boxing ring of ideas is good, although now that I've got this cartoon version in my head. And boxing ring of people, not necessarily so, right?
yeah, I think that's great. I'd missed that comment, and you yeah, I think that's great. And yeah, depersonalizing the conflict. I mean, it's hard. It's easy
Mhm.
to say, hard to do, but really important that
Yeah.
we try.
And it's
Um,
important to not take criticism personally. It's entirely possible to criticize a project without criticizing a person.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, thanks, Alexia. I'm absolutely sure, even from this relatively short conversation we've had, that people will want to stay in touch. They'll want to connect with you. They'll want to, you know, get their hands on a copy of your book. So, how can people connect with you, and where can people get the book?
So for me, the two places, go-to places are Amazon and Routledge, which is the publisher. But I do note that Routledge has this book appearing at other booksellers. So Waterstones and the like are also carrying it, or perhaps have it on their to-order list. As for me, LinkedIn is a great place to connect. Also, I am on Twitter and Blue Sky. And then I'd say also, if you're interested in other things I've written, you can take a look at ResearchGate
Fantastic. And
or,
I'm
or
just going.
come or come to the University of Virginia and take my courses.
Well, there, that would be amazing. That I would love to do that. That would be quite a commute for me, though. But and I'm just going to type the name of the book into the
Ah,
chat. So
yes. So the
that's the
book
name.
is yes, Strategic Project Analysis.
Oh no,
Although
sorry,
honestly,
that's
there
the
are
name
so
of the
few people
webinar.
with that.
I've typed the wrong name in. I went on to autopilot.
Well,
Yes,
you got it
strategic.
maybe backwards. It is a stunning. There's a comment here that UVA is a stunningly beautiful campus. In fact, yes, it is, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well.
Wow, wow,
Yes,
wow.
an absolute privilege to be there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I mean, again, there are so many more things that could be said. So I think a definite a virtual round of applause for Dr. Alexia. I can see the emojis starting to come up with rounds of applause and so on. So So thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to be here. For those of you on the line, do stay on the line just for a little bit longer because I have a few sort of community announcements. The first one is the next webinar, and the next webinar will be on Thursday, March the 20th. And I'm going to paste the name of it into the chat, and then I'll paste the. Oh, I've got too many tabs open. I don't know if anyone's like me. Um, I always have hundreds of tabs open. But the next webinar is Projects, Products, and Business Analysis: Navigating the New Normal with Hannah Pearson Coates. And it's going to be another conversational style one. So if you've got questions about product versus project and agile and all of those sorts of good things, then you can get some insight from there. I'll just get the registration link for you here, and I will paste that in the chat so you can register straight away for that one. Um, Also, if you haven't already seen the Q1 edition of BA Digest, I hope most people tuning in are aware of BA Digest. If you're not, it is a quarterly PDF magazine which covers all things BA related. It's open access, so you don't have to register. It's literally all the entire back catalogue is there free for you to read at any time. And we have an open submission process. So if you have an idea for an article, you don't even have to write it. The way it works is you submit an idea and a few bullet points, and we will get back to you. And you don't have to be a professional writer, so we help with editing and copy editing. Well, we do technical review, copy editing, and proofing and design. So if you have an idea and you want the kudos of being published in BA Digest, then do get in touch. And finally, there was one other thing I was going to post in the chat, which I have. No, that's everything. That is everything. So, thank you very much for tuning in live. If you have a colleague who would benefit from seeing this session, you can send them the recording. The recording will be available within 24 hours. So, thank you everyone for tuning in. Alexia, great to see you again. And thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.